when my daughter Aaliyah Cooper leaned over my hospital bed and whispered, "Don't get too comfortable, Mom. You'll never leave this place alive." I thought the pain medication was making me hallucinate. But when she smiled that cold, calculating smile and adjusted my IV drip with gloved hands, I knew this wasn't a fever dream. My own flesh and blood was planning to kill me. What she didn't know was that my phone was tucked under my pillow, recording every word. For 3 weeks, I'd been recovering from what everyone believed was a simple gallbladder surgery at Oakridge Medical Center. But as I lay there pretending to sleep, listening to Aaliyah discuss insurance payouts with someone on the phone, I realized my surgery had been anything but routine. My daughter had orchestrated everything. The question wasn't whether she was trying to murder me, it was how long I had to gather evidence before she succeeded. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 2 months before that chilling whisper in my hospital bed, everything seemed perfect. My name is Madeline Rivera, and at 63, I thought I had raised a successful, loving daughter. Aaliyah Cooper, she'd taken her father's name after our divorce, was everything a mother could hope for. A registered nurse at Oakridge Medical Center, she lived in a beautiful townhouse in Millbrook Heights, drove a pristine white BMW, and called me every Sunday without fail. "Mom, you're working too hard at that flower shop," she'd say during our weekly conversations, her voice filled with what I believed was genuine concern. "You should think about retirement. Maybe sell the house and move somewhere smaller, more manageable." I'd laugh it off. Rivera's garden paradise had been my life's work for 25 years. After my divorce from Thomas Cooper, that little flower shop in downtown Willowbrook became my sanctuary, my identity, my financial independence. The Victorian house I'd bought with the divorce settlement was paid off, and I had a comfortable nest egg in my savings account. Life was good. Aaliyah would visit every few weeks, always bearing gifts, expensive chocolates, designer scarves, or a bottle of wine that cost more than I'd spend on groceries in a week. She'd critique my house gently. "This place is getting too big for you, Mom. The stairs are dangerous at your age, and this neighborhood isn't what it used to be." I'd brush off her concerns. The stairs weren't that steep, and Willowbrook was as safe as it had always been. But Aaliyah was persistent in her worry, and I found it touching that my successful daughter cared so much about her aging mother. "I've been thinking," she said one particularly memorable Sunday in March, "maybe you should come stay with me for a while, just to try it out. See how you like having someone around to help." The offer was tempting. Aaliyah's townhouse was stunning, all marble countertops, hardwood floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows. She'd decorated it like something from a magazine, with expensive art on the walls and furniture that looked like it belonged in a showroom. When I'd ask how she afforded such luxury on a nurse's salary, she'd wave dismissively. "I'm good with investments, Mom. Plus, Gerald Kelly from the hospital administration department has been mentoring me in financial planning. You remember Gerald? Tall guy, always wears those expensive suits. He's helped a lot of the staff build wealth." I didn't remember Gerald Kelly, but Aaliyah spoke about him often. Apparently, he was some kind of financial genius who'd helped her maximize her retirement contributions and make smart investment choices. She'd show me screenshots of her portfolio on her phone, numbers that made my eyes widen. My daughter was apparently worth over $300,000 at 34 years old. "You could have this too, Mom," she'd say, scrolling through her investment app. "If you liquidated the flower shop and the house, we could invest that money properly, make it work for you instead of you working for it." But I wasn't ready to retire. Rivera's garden paradise wasn't just a business, it was my passion. Every morning, I'd arrive at 6 a.m. to receive flower deliveries, spending my days creating arrangements that brought joy to people's special moments. Weddings, anniversaries, apologies, celebrations. I was part of all of it. The thought of giving that up felt like giving up a piece of my soul. Aaliyah seemed to understand, but I noticed she'd grown more insistent over the months. Her visits became more frequent, and each time she'd point out something new that concerned her about my living situation. "Mom, look at this loose handrail," she'd say, wiggling the banister on my front porch. "What if you fell? And this electrical outlet in the kitchen is sparking. That's a fire hazard." She wasn't wrong. The house was old and needed maintenance. But these weren't emergencies, just the normal wear and tear of a home built in 1965. Still, Aaliyah's concern felt genuine, and I found myself questioning whether I was being stubborn about staying in a house that might actually be becoming unsafe for a woman my age. Then came the health scares. It started with small things. I'd feel dizzy during particularly busy days at the shop, or I'd get short of breath arranging heavy funeral displays. Aaliyah, with her medical training, became increasingly worried. "Mom, these symptoms aren't normal for someone your age. You need to see a doctor. Actually, why don't you let me make an appointment for you at Oakridge? I can get you in with Dr. Frederick Scott. He's the best internist in the hospital." Dr. Scott was professional and thorough. After a series of tests, he diagnosed me with mild hypertension and recommended lifestyle changes. Less salt, more exercise, regular monitoring. Nothing too serious, but Aaliyah treated it like a death sentence. "See, I told you something was wrong," she said as we left the appointment. "You need to start taking better care of yourself. Maybe it really is time to consider making some changes." Looking back now, I realize that was when the seeds were planted. Not in my mind, but in Aaliyah's plan. Every health concern, every household maintenance issue, every comment about my age and vulnerability, it was all building towards something I couldn't see coming, because at that time, all I saw was a loving daughter who cared about her mother's well-being. I had no idea that behind those concerned brown eyes, behind that nurse's caring exterior, my own daughter was calculating the exact dollar amount my death would be worth. The first crack in my perfect daughter's facade appeared on a rainy Thursday, in April. I remember the date exactly, April 18th, because it was the day before my 64th birthday, and Aaliyah had insisted on taking me out for what she called a pre-birthday celebration. We were having lunch at Thornfield Bistro, an upscale restaurant in the medical district that Aaliyah frequented. She'd ordered for both of us without asking, grilled salmon for her, chicken Caesar salad for me. "You need to watch your sodium." "Mom?" she'd said when I'd glanced at the menu longingly at the pasta dishes. Everything seemed normal until her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and I watched her face change. The warm smile faltered for just a second, replaced by something harder, more calculating. She quickly turned the phone face down, but not before I caught a glimpse of the message preview. Insurance. "Paperwork ready for review?" "Who was that?" I asked casually, spearing a piece of lettuce. "Oh, just work stuff," Aaliyah replied. But her voice had that tight quality it got when she was lying. I knew that tone. I'd heard it when she was 16, and telling me she'd been studying at the library when she'd actually been at parties. "Insurance paperwork? I thought you said the hospital handles all that automatically." She laughed, but it sounded forced. "They do, mostly. This is just continuing education stuff. Gerald Kelly is helping some of us understand different types of policies. You know, for when we have patients with questions." Gerald Kelly again. It seemed like every conversation we'd had in the past month somehow circled back to this man I'd never met. When I'd asked to meet him, maybe invite him over for dinner as a thank you for helping Aaliyah with her finances, she'd always had an excuse. He was too busy. He traveled a lot for work. He was very private. But what really made my stomach twist was what happened next. Aaliyah excused herself to use the restroom, leaving her phone on the table. I wasn't trying to snoop. The screen lit up on its own when another message came in. This time, I could see the full preview from someone labeled GK. Policy amounts confirmed. $750K life, $200K accident. Timeline? My blood went cold. Life insurance? I had a small policy through my business, maybe $50,000 to cover funeral expenses. When had Aaliyah taken out such massive coverage? And why was someone asking about timelines? When she returned, I was staring at my salad, trying to process what I'd seen. "Everything okay, Mom? You look pale?" "I'm fine," I managed. "Just tired." But I wasn't fine. That message kept echoing in my mind. $750K life insurance. Timeline. The way her expression had shifted when she'd read that first message. Something was very wrong, but I couldn't quite grasp what. The strange behavior continued over the next few weeks. Aaliyah became even more attentive, calling me multiple times a day to check on my health. She'd drop by the flower shop unannounced, always with some small gift and increasingly urgent concerns about my well-being. "Mom, you're working too hard," she'd say, watching me. "Arrange a wedding bouquet. Look how your hands are shaking." I'd glance down at my perfectly steady hands, confused. "They're not shaking, honey." "They are. You're probably developing tremors. That's common in people your age, especially with your blood pressure issues." But my blood pressure was well controlled, with the medication Dr. Scott had prescribed. And my hands were steady enough to create intricate floral arrangements that customers praised constantly. Yet Aaliyah seemed determined to convince me, and anyone who would listen, that I was deteriorating rapidly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She started joining me for my doctor's appointments, which I initially appreciated. Having a medical professional advocate for me seemed like a blessing. But during my follow-up with Dr. Scott, Aaliyah's behavior struck me as odd. "Doctor, I'm really concerned about my mother's memory," she said before I could even speak. "She's been forgetting things, getting confused about dates, and she's been having more dizzy spells." I stared at her in shock. "Aaliyah, that's not true. I haven't been—" "Mom, you called me yesterday asking what day it was," she interrupted gently, giving me a look that somehow conveyed both love and pity. But I hadn't called her at all yesterday. In fact, she'd called me, and our conversation had been perfectly normal. Dr. Scott was writing notes, nodding seriously as Aaliyah continued describing symptoms I didn't have. After the appointment, as we walked to our cars, I confronted her. "Why did you tell Dr. Scott those things? I'm not having memory problems or dizzy spells." Aaliyah's face softened into that concerned expression she'd perfected. "Mom, that's exactly what I'm talking about. You don't remember calling me yesterday, do you?" The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment I questioned myself. Had I called her? Was I forgetting things? But no. I kept a detailed calendar, and I remembered our conversations clearly. She was lying, but why? That night, I did something I hadn't done since Aaliyah was a teenager. I started paying closer attention to her lies. The next week, she claimed I'd left the stove on overnight. But I hadn't cooked anything that day. She said I'd seemed confused when she'd visited the flower shop, but I'd been perfectly clear during our conversation about her upcoming vacation plans. She told Dr. Scott that I'd fallen in my house, but the only stumble I'd had was when I'd tripped over her purse, which she'd left in the middle of my hallway. Each lie was small, seemingly motivated by concern. But together, they were building a narrative that terrified me. The story of a woman whose mind and body were failing faster than she realized. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later, during what Aaliyah called a family financial planning session. She arrived at my house with a briefcase full of papers and Gerald Kelly's business card. "Mom, I've been talking to Gerald about your situation. With your health declining, we need to make sure your affairs are in order." She spread documents across my kitchen table, life insurance applications, power of attorney forms, papers to add her name to my bank accounts for emergency access. The life insurance application was for $750,000, with Aaliyah listed as the sole beneficiary. This Seems like a lot of insurance, I said carefully. Gerald says it's standard for someone with your assets. The flower shop, the house. If something happened to you, there would be estate taxes and business debts to settle. This protects your legacy. But as I read through the papers, I noticed something chilling. The application listed me as having multiple health conditions I didn't have: early dementia, chronic heart problems, frequent falls. According to this document, I was a 64-year-old woman whose health was deteriorating rapidly. Aaliyah, these health conditions are incorrect. She leaned over my shoulder, her voice gentle but firm. Mom, I filled those out based on what Dr. Scott has been documenting. You might not remember all your symptoms, but they're in your medical record. That's when I knew, with horrible certainty, that my own daughter was systematically building a case for my mental and physical incompetence. The question was, why? I signed nothing that day. When I tried to share my concerns with the people closest to me, I quickly learned how skillfully Aaliyah had laid the groundwork for my dismissal. It was like watching a master manipulator's plan unfold in real time, except I was the target and no one believed me. My first attempt at seeking support came during my weekly coffee date with my best friend, Trisha Davies. Trisha and I had been friends for over 30 years. We'd weathered divorces, raised our children together, and supported each other through every major life event. If anyone would listen to me, it would be her. We met at our usual spot, Copper Bean Cafe in downtown Willowbrook, and I tried to casually bring up my concerns about Aaliyah's recent behavior. Trisha, have you noticed anything strange about Aaliyah lately? I asked, stirring my cappuccino nervously. Strange how? She looked genuinely confused. She seems wonderful to me, very attentive to you. That's just it. She's almost too attentive. And she keeps insisting I have health problems that I don't actually have. Trisha set down her coffee cup and gave me a long, searching look. Madeline, honey, Aaliyah is a medical professional. She probably notices things that you don't. Isn't it better to be safe than sorry? But she's lying, Trisha. She told Dr. Scott that I called her confused about what day it was, but I never made that call. She said I left my stove on overnight, but I didn't cook that day. The expression on Trisha's face shifted from confusion to something that looked uncomfortably like pity. Are you sure you remember these things correctly? I mean, we're both getting older, and sometimes I'm not having memory problems. I interrupted, probably more sharply than I intended. Trisha reached across the table and patted my hand. Of course you're not, but maybe you're being a little hard on Aaliyah. She loves you, and she's probably just worried. I wish my daughter was half as attentive as yours. The conversation left me feeling frustrated and doubted. Had Aaliyah already spoken to Trisha? Had she planted seeds of concern about my mental state, even with my closest friend? My suspicions were confirmed the next week when I ran into Trisha at the grocery store. She approached me with an overly bright smile and spoke to me like I was a fragile, confused elderly woman. Madeline, how are you feeling today? Aaliyah mentioned you've been having some rough days lately. When had Aaliyah talked to Trisha? And what exactly had she said? I tried a different approach with my neighbor, Kevin Morgan, who lived in the house next to mine and often helped me with yard work. Kevin was practical, logical, and had known me for 15 years. Surely he would see through any lies about my competence. Kevin, I need to ask you something, I said one Saturday morning as he was trimming his hedges. Have you noticed me acting confused or forgetful lately? He paused, hedge clippers in hand, and gave me a thoughtful look. Well, now that you mention it, Aaliyah did stop by last week. She seemed pretty worried about you living alone. Said you'd been having some issues. My heart sank. What kind of issues? She mentioned you'd been forgetting to lock your doors, leaving lights on all night. She was concerned about your safety. Kevin's expression was kind, but clearly influenced by whatever story Aaliyah had told him. Kevin, I always lock my doors, and I'm very conscious about electricity usage. I turn. Lights off religiously. He nodded, but I could see in his eyes that he thought I was being defensive, maybe even unaware of my own declining capabilities. Of course, Madeline. Aaliyah just worries about you. That's all. It's nice to have a daughter who cares so much. The pattern was becoming clear. Aaliyah had systematically contacted the important people in my life, my best friend, my neighbor, probably others, and planted concerns about my mental state and physical safety. She'd done it subtly, presenting herself as the worried, loving daughter, just trying to look out for her aging mother. My attempts to push back only reinforced their belief that I was becoming paranoid or defensive about my declining abilities. The most devastating dismissal came from my own brother, Levi Lewis, during our monthly phone call. Levi lived 3 states away in Colorado, and we typically caught up every few weeks. I'd always been able to count on his practical perspective and unwavering support. Levi, I'm worried about Aaliyah, I said, diving straight into my concerns. She's been acting strangely, lying about my health, pushing me to sign financial documents. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Levi spoke, his voice was careful, measured. Madeline, Aaliyah called me a couple weeks ago. My stomach dropped. She did? She's really concerned about you. She said you've been having memory issues, getting confused about conversations you've had. She mentioned you think people are lying to you about things that really happened. The manipulation was so thorough, so calculated, that I felt dizzy. Aaliyah had preemptively contacted my brother to frame any concerns I might raise as symptoms of paranoia or cognitive decline. Levi, I'm not confused. I'm not paranoid. Aaliyah is manipulating the situation, and I think she's planning something terrible. Madeline. His voice held that same note of gentle pity I'd heard from Trisha and Kevin. Maybe you should listen to Aaliyah's advice about getting more medical evaluation. There's no shame in needing help as we get older. I don't need help. I need someone to believe me. Someone to believe me. But even as I said it, I could hear how I sounded. Desperate, irrational, exactly like someone whose grip on reality was slipping. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and realized the full scope of Aaliyah's strategy. She hadn't just been lying about my health to doctors and insurance companies. She'd been systematically discrediting me with everyone in my support network, ensuring that if I ever tried to expose her plan, I would sound like a confused, paranoid, elderly woman. The isolation was complete. Every person I trusted had been turned into an unwitting ally in Aaliyah's campaign to paint me as mentally incompetent. Any protest I made would only reinforce their belief that I was losing my faculties. But the cruelest part was how she'd framed her manipulation as love. To everyone else, Aaliyah appeared to be the perfect daughter, patient, caring, and appropriately concerned about her aging mother's well-being. My attempts to expose her lies made me look ungrateful, defensive, and potentially unstable. That night, I made a decision that would prove crucial in the weeks to come. If no one would believe my words, I would have to find another way to document the truth. I started keeping a detailed journal, recording every conversation, every lie, every manipulation. I also began something that felt both paranoid and necessary. I started treating my own daughter like a potential threat, because that's exactly what she was. The question was, what was she threatening me with, and how far was she willing to go? I was about to find out. The moment I decided to actively investigate my own daughter came on a gray Monday morning in late May. I was opening Rivera's Garden Paradise, going through my usual routine of checking the overnight flower deliveries, when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the shop's front door, but not from age or illness, from fear. Because sitting on my shop's doorstep was a small white envelope with no postmark, no return address, just my name written in block letters across the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper that looked like it had been copied from a medical chart. At the top it read, "Patient, Madeline Rivera, Cognitive Assessment Summary." The document detailed a series of mental health evaluations I had never undergone, describing progressive memory loss, confusion, and early-stage dementia symptoms. It was dated just 3 days earlier, but 3 days ago, I had been working in my shop, perfectly lucid, creating elaborate arrangements for the Hendersons' 50th wedding anniversary celebration. I had never been to any cognitive assessment. I had never spoken to the psychologist listed on the report, Dr. Aaliyah King. Yet here was an official-looking document claiming I was mentally incompetent, complete with a recommendation for immediate family intervention and possible conservatorship proceedings. My daughter wasn't just lying about my health. She was creating false medical records. That's when I realized I had reached a point of no return. Either I was losing my mind and couldn't remember major medical appointments, or my daughter was orchestrating an elaborate fraud designed to have me declared mentally incompetent. Given that I could still remember every customer's flower preferences, every supplier's delivery schedule, and every detail of my business operations, I was betting on fraud. But proving it would require me to do something that went against every instinct I had as a mother. I would have to investigate Aaliyah like she was a criminal. I spent that morning making a plan. First, I called Dr. Aaliyah King's office, claiming I needed to reschedule an appointment I couldn't remember making. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Rivera," the receptionist said after checking her computer. "We don't have any appointments scheduled for you, and I don't see that you've ever been a patient here. Are you certain? My daughter said she'd scheduled a cognitive assessment for me." "No, ma'am, nothing in our system. Would you like to schedule an evaluation?" I declined and hung up, my suspicions confirmed. Someone had created that medical report, using Dr. King's name and credentials, but I had never been to her office. Next, I drove to Oakridge Medical Center, where Aaliyah worked. I knew I was taking a risk. If she saw me there, it might accelerate whatever timeline she was operating on. But I needed to understand the scope of her deception. I parked across the street and watched the staff entrance, trying to spot Gerald. Kelly, the mysterious financial advisor who seemed to be helping Aaliyah with her planning. After 2 hours, I saw a man in an expensive gray suit entering the building. He matched Aaliyah's description of Gerald. Tall, well-dressed, carrying a briefcase that suggested financial business rather than medical care. I followed him inside, staying far enough back to avoid attention. He didn't go to the elevator that led to patient floors or administrative offices. Instead, he headed directly to a conference room near the hospital's business office. Through the window, I could see him spreading papers across the table, preparing for what looked like a meeting. 10 minutes later, Aaliyah arrived. I positioned myself in the medical center's cafe, where I could see into the conference room through the large windows. They were too far away for me to hear their conversation, but their body language told a story. Gerald was pointing to documents. Aaliyah was nodding and taking notes. At one point, he handed her what looked like official forms, and she signed several papers. When Gerald left, he walked right past my table. I pretended to be absorbed in a magazine, but I could see the logo on his briefcase. Kelly Insurance Consulting, Estate Planning and Asset Management. Not a hospital employee. Not a financial advisor helping nursing staff with retirement planning. Gerald Kelly was an insurance consultant, and he'd been meeting with my daughter in a hospital conference room to discuss what I could only assume were plans involving my death. That evening, I made the most difficult decision of my life. I would have to pretend everything was normal while secretly gathering evidence against my own daughter. I would have to smile and nod while she continued her campaign to have me declared incompetent, all while building a case to expose her. But I wasn't going to do it alone. I called someone I hadn't spoken to in 5 years, my ex-husband Thomas Cooper. Thomas was Aaliyah's father, but our relationship with him had been complicated since the divorce. He'd moved to Phoenix for his job and had maintained minimal contact with Aaliyah over the years. But Thomas was also a retired police detective, and if anyone would understand the seriousness of what I was uncovering, it would be him. Madeline? Thomas sounded surprised when he answered the phone. Is everything okay? No, Tom, it's not. I need your help, and I need you to listen carefully without interrupting. I told him everything. The insurance messages, the false medical reports, the systematic isolation from my support network, the meeting I'd witnessed between Aaliyah and Gerald Kelly. When I finished, there was a long silence. You're telling me you think our daughter is planning to kill you for insurance money? I'm telling you that I have evidence suggesting she's been building a case to have me declared mentally incompetent while simultaneously taking out massive life insurance policies on me. The logical endpoint of that combination is terrifying, Thomas. Was quiet for a moment. Then, what do you need from me? Relief flooded through me. Finally, someone who didn't dismiss my concerns as paranoid delusions. I need help investigating this properly. I need someone with law enforcement experience to help me document what's happening. And I need someone who can't be dismissed as a confused elderly woman. I can be on a plane tomorrow, Thomas said. But Madeline, if you're right about this, we need to be very careful. If Aaliyah is planning something and she realizes you're onto her, it could accelerate her timeline. I know. That's why I have to keep pretending everything is normal while we gather evidence. Can you do that? Can you act normally around someone you believe is planning to kill you? I thought about the fake medical report sitting on my kitchen table, about the insurance meeting I'd witnessed, about the systematic way Aaliyah had isolated me from everyone who might believe my story. I'm going to have to, I said, because the alternative is waiting around to become her victim. That night, I started what I now think of as my double life. During the day, I would be the increasingly frail, confused mother that Aaliyah needed me to be for her plan to work. But in secret, I would be documenting every lie, every manipulation, every piece of evidence that might save my life. I had no idea how much time I had before Aaliyah moved from planning to action. But I was done being a passive victim of her manipulation. The investigation was about to begin. Thomas arrived in Willowbrook on a Wednesday evening, checking into the Grand Bridge Inn under an assumed name, Michael Torres. We'd agreed that no one could know he was in town, especially not Aaliyah. As far as she knew, her father remained in Phoenix, distant and uninvolved in my life. Our first meeting took place at Millstone Park, a quiet spot on the outskirts of town where we could talk without being overheard. Thomas looked older than I remembered, more gray in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes. But his detective instincts were as sharp as ever. "Show me everything," he said, settling onto a park bench beside me. I handed him the folder I'd compiled, the fake medical report, copies of the insurance documents Aaliyah had tried to get me to sign, photos I'd secretly taken of her meeting with Gerald Kelly, and detailed notes about every lie she'd told to my doctors, friends, and family. Thomas studied each document carefully, occasionally asking questions that reminded me why he'd been such a good detective. This Dr. Eliza King report. The formatting looks professional, but see how the letterhead font is slightly different from what's on their actual website? Someone reproduced this logo, probably from a screenshot. He was right. I'd been so focused on the content that I hadn't noticed the subtle formatting differences. And this insurance application listing you as having dementia and heart problems, when did you first see this? 3 weeks ago, when Aaliyah brought it for me to sign. But according to the dates on these forms, they were submitted to the insurance company 5 weeks ago, with your forged signature. My hands began to shake. She filed an insurance application in my name without my knowledge? That's what it looks like. And if the insurance company approved coverage based on false medical information, that's insurance fraud. But we need more evidence to prove Aaliyah was the one who submitted these documents. Thomas had brought his own resources to the investigation. His former partner, Detective Archie Nelson, now worked insurance fraud cases for the state. Within 24 hours, Archie had confirmed that several suspicious life insurance applications had been filed in my name across different companies, totaling nearly $2 million in coverage. "Your daughter's been busy," Thomas told me during our second meeting at the park. "Multiple policies with different companies, all listing various health conditions you don't have. But here's the interesting part. They were all submitted through the same insurance consulting firm." "Kelly Insurance Consulting?" "Exactly. Gerald Kelly has been the broker for every single policy. This isn't just fraud, it's organized, systematic fraud. But we needed more than paperwork. We needed to catch Aaliyah in the act of her deception." Thomas suggested we set up surveillance, but I had a better idea. I knew Aaliyah's schedule, her habits, her weaknesses. Instead of following her, we would let her come to us. I called Aaliyah and told her I'd been having more episodes. Confusion, dizziness, memory lapses. I told her I was scared and ready to consider her suggestions about moving in with her and signing the financial documents she'd been pushing. "Really, Mom?" Her voice brightened with what I now recognized as calculated excitement rather than genuine relief. "I think that's a wise decision. Why don't I come over tomorrow evening, and we can go through everything together?" The next evening, Thomas positioned himself in my backyard garden shed with a clear view into my kitchen through the window. He had a digital recorder and a camera with a telephoto lens. Meanwhile, I wore a small recording device that Thomas had procured, a tiny microphone clipped inside my cardigan that would capture our entire conversation. Aaliyah arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, carrying her briefcase and a bottle of what she claimed was my favorite wine. "I thought we could celebrate this new chapter in your life," she said, uncorking the bottle. "You're making the right choice, Mom." As she poured 2 glasses, I noticed her movements were unusually careful. She turned her back to me while handling my glass, and when she handed it to me, I pretended to take a sip while actually keeping the wine away from my lips. "Now, let's go through these documents," Aaliyah said, spreading papers across my kitchen table. "I've had Gerald review everything, and he's made sure we're covering all the bases for your protection." The irony of her talking about my protection while potentially drugging my wine wasn't lost on me. The documents were even more extensive than before. Power of attorney forms that would give her complete control over my finances. A revised will that left everything to her. Medical directives that would allow her to make all healthcare decisions on my behalf. And new life insurance applications for even larger amounts. "This seems like a lot of insurance," I said, trying to sound confused rather than suspicious. "Gerald explains it perfectly," Aaliyah said, her voice taking on that patient tone she used when she thought I was being slow. "With your declining health, we need to make sure there's enough coverage for long-term care costs, estate taxes, and final expenses. But I feel fine most of the time." Aaliyah's expression shifted slightly, a flash of irritation quickly masked by concern. "Mom, that's exactly the problem. You don't realize how much you've declined. Dr. Scott is very worried about your cognitive state." "What has Dr. Scott said?" "He thinks you need immediate evaluation by a specialist. In fact, he's recommended that you be admitted for observation." This was news to me. Dr. Scott had never mentioned hospitalization during our appointments. "When did he tell you this?" "Yesterday, when I called to update him on your condition. He's very concerned about the episodes you've been having." Another lie. I hadn't seen Dr. Scott in 3 weeks, and I hadn't given Aaliyah permission to contact him about my health. But then Aaliyah said something that made my blood freeze. "Actually, Mom, I've already arranged for you to be admitted to Oakridge Medical Center tomorrow morning, just for observation and some tests. I know it seems sudden, but Dr. Scott thinks it's necessary." I stared at her, my mind racing. She was planning to have me hospitalized based on false information she'd given to my doctor. Once I was in the hospital, under her influence as both my healthcare proxy and a nurse at the facility, she could control every aspect of my care. I don't want to go to the hospital, I said. Aaliyah's mask slipped further. Mom, you don't really have a choice. Dr. Scott has already prepared the admission orders. And honestly, after talking to Gerald about the insurance policies, we need to make sure your health conditions are properly documented. The threat was implicit but clear. If I didn't voluntarily admit myself to the hospital, she had ways to make it happen. And once I was there, with her controlling my medical care and having access to my IV lines, medications, and charts, I understood with crystal clarity that Aaliyah wasn't just planning to have me declared incompetent. She was planning to kill me in the hospital, where she could control the circumstances and ensure it looked like natural causes. Okay, I said quietly, pretending to be defeated. If you think it's best. Aaliyah smiled, and for the first time, I saw genuine warmth in her expression. Not because she loved me, but because her plan was working perfectly. I think it's best, Mom. Trust me, I'm going to take very good care of you. After she left, Thomas emerged from the shed with recordings and photographs that would change everything. We had documented evidence of Aaliyah lying about doctors' recommendations, forging medical necessity for hospitalization, and discussing insurance policies in the context of my supposedly declining health. But most importantly, we had proof that she was planning to admit me to the hospital the next day, where she would have unlimited access to me as both my healthcare proxy and a staff member. We have enough to go to the police, Thomas said. No, I replied. Not yet. If we expose her now, she'll just claim she was trying to help me, and everyone will believe her because of the foundation she's laid. We need to catch her in the act. Madeline, that's incredibly dangerous. I know, but it's the only way to prove what she's really planning. That night, I made the decision that would either save my life or end it. I would go to the hospital as planned, but I wouldn't go defenseless. Thomas would maintain surveillance from outside, and I would document everything that happened once I was under Aaliyah's care. If my daughter was planning to kill me, I was going to make sure the evidence survived even if I didn't. I arrived at Oakridge Medical Center the next morning at 8 a.m., carrying a small overnight bag that contained more than just pajamas and toiletries. Hidden in the lining of my cosmetics case was a tiny recording device Thomas had given me, no bigger than a button with a 72-hour battery life. Tucked inside my book was a backup phone, set to silent but recording continuously. Thomas had also given me a small vial of what looked like vitamins, but were actually designed to counteract common sedatives just in case. I feel like a spy. I'd told him that morning during our final briefing at Millstone Park. You are a spy, he'd replied grimly. You're going behind enemy lines to gather intelligence on someone who wants you dead. The only difference is that the enemy is your daughter. Aaliyah met me at the hospital's main entrance, all smiles and professional efficiency. She wore her scrubs and her hospital ID badge, looking every inch the caring medical professional. Mom, I'm so proud of you for taking this step, she said, linking her arm through mine. Dr. Scott is waiting for us upstairs, and I've made sure you'll have one of the best rooms on the medical floor. Room 314 was indeed nice, private, with a view of the hospital's garden courtyard. But as Aaliyah helped me settle in, I noticed details that made my skin crawl. The room was at the end of a long hallway, isolated from the nurses' station. The window didn't open, and the bathroom had no lock on the door. It was perfect for someone who wanted privacy to do things they shouldn't. Dr. Scott arrived within an hour, and I immediately understood how Aaliyah had manipulated him. He was young, probably early 30s, and clearly deferential to Aaliyah's medical expertise and familiarity with my case. Mrs. Rivera, your daughter, has filled me in on your recent episodes, he said, consulting a chart that I knew contained false information. We're going to run some tests to get a better picture of what's going on. What kind of tests? I asked. Aaliyah answered before Dr. Scott could respond. Cognitive assessments, blood work to check for deficiencies that might be causing confusion, and some brain imaging to rule out any structural issues. Dr. Scott nodded along, but I could see he was essentially rubber stamping whatever Aaliyah had recommended. She was the experienced nurse, the caring daughter, the medical professional who knew my history. Why would he question her judgment? After Dr. Scott left, Aaliyah's demeanor shifted subtly. The performance was still there, but underneath it, I could sense her excitement. She was finally in her element, a hospital setting where she had authority, access, and control. "Now, Mom, I want you to rest while we wait for the test results," she said, adjusting my IV line with practiced efficiency. "I've arranged my schedule so I can be your primary nurse during your stay. No one will take better care of you than I will." That threat disguised as reassurance sent chills down my spine. Over the next few hours, I observed Aaliyah's routine and began to understand the scope of her planning. She had clearly been preparing for this hospitalization for weeks, maybe months. She knew which shifts had the fewest supervisors, which doctors were most likely to defer to nursing judgment, and which parts of the hospital had the least surveillance. She'd also cultivated relationships with key staff members. When other nurses stopped by my room, they all praised Aaliyah's dedication to her mother's care. "You're so lucky to have such a devoted daughter," said one older nurse named Millie Diaz. "Aaliyah has been so worried about you. She's been researching your symptoms for weeks, trying to understand what might be wrong." What struck me was how Aaliyah had positioned herself as the expert on my condition, the primary source of information about my health history and symptoms. Any medical decisions would naturally flow through her, and any concerns about my care would be filtered through her professional judgment. The first real confirmation of my suspicions came that evening. Aaliyah was working the night shift, and, around 10 p.m., she entered my room with a syringe and a concerned expression. "Mom, your blood pressure is elevated, and you seem agitated. Dr. Scott has ordered a mild sedative to help you rest." I hadn't felt agitated, and the blood pressure monitor beside my bed showed normal readings. But Aaliyah moved toward my IV, line with professional confidence. "What kind of sedative?" I asked. "Just something to help you sleep. Hospitals can be stressful environments, especially for someone with your condition." I watched her prepare to inject the contents of the syringe into my IV port. This was it, the moment I'd been dreading and preparing for. If I allowed her to proceed, I might never wake up. If I refused, I'd have to reveal that I knew what she was planning. "Actually, I'd prefer not to have anything right now," I said as calmly as I could manage. I was just starting to feel drowsy naturally. Aaliyah paused, the syringe inches from my IV line. For a moment, her mask slipped completely, and I saw something cold and calculating in her eyes. "Mom, the doctor ordered this medication. I really think you should trust medical professionals to know what's best for you. I'm sure it can wait until morning if I'm able to sleep on my own." The standoff lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, Aaliyah smiled tightly and stepped back. "Of course, Mom. Patient comfort is always our priority. I'll just note in your chart that you declined the medication." After she left, I realized my hands were shaking. I'd just refused what could have been a lethal injection, but I'd also revealed that I wasn't the compliant, confused patient she needed me to be. Around midnight, I heard voices outside my room. Through the partially open door, I could see Aaliyah talking quietly with Gerald Kelly. He wasn't supposed to be in the hospital at that hour. Visiting hours had ended at 9 p.m. But somehow, he was there, in the hallway outside my room, having what appeared to be an urgent conversation with my daughter. I activated the recording device hidden in my gown and strained to hear their conversation. "Timeline is accelerating," Gerald was saying. "The insurance companies are starting to ask questions about the multiple applications. We need to move quickly." "I understand," Aaliyah replied. "But she's being difficult. She refused the sedative. Tonight. Can you override her refusal?" "Not without raising suspicions. Dr. Scott is young, but he's not stupid. If a patient repeatedly refuses medication and then dies, it looks suspicious." What about the other approach we discussed? Aaliyah was quiet for a moment. That's riskier, but it might be necessary. I can make it look like a complication from her underlying condition. How long do you need? Give me 48 hours. If I can't handle it medically, we'll have to consider the accident scenario. Accident scenario. The words made my blood run cold. They weren't just planning to kill me in the hospital. They had backup plans. After Gerald left, Aaliyah returned to my room to check on me. I pretended to be asleep, but I could feel her standing beside my bed for a long time, just watching me. When she finally left, I heard the unmistakable sound of my door being locked from the outside. I was no longer a patient in this hospital. I was a prisoner. And somewhere in the building, my daughter was planning my murder with clinical precision and multiple contingency plans. The recording device captured everything, but I was beginning to wonder if I'd live long enough for anyone to hear it. The next morning brought a revelation that shattered any remaining illusions I had about my daughter's motives. It started when a different nurse, someone I'd never seen before, entered my room around 6 a.m. for routine vitals. "Good morning, Mrs. Rivera. I'm Daisy Clark from the day shift," she said cheerfully, checking my blood pressure. "How are you? Feeling today?" "Much better, thank you. Will my regular nurse be in soon?" Daisy looked confused. "Regular nurse? According to the chart, you don't have a regular nurse assigned. We rotate based on patient load and shift schedules." My stomach dropped. But my daughter, Aaliyah Cooper, said she'd arranged to be my primary nurse during my stay. "Oh, Aaliyah!" Daisy's expression brightened with recognition. "She's not actually assigned to this floor. She works in the cardiac unit downstairs, but she's been so worried about you. She's been checking on you during her breaks and coordinating with your actual care team." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Aaliyah wasn't my nurse. She had no official authority over my care or access to my medications. Everything she'd been doing, adjusting my IV, attempting to give me injections, having private access to my room, was unauthorized. She'd been impersonating my caregiver. "Nurse Clark," I said carefully, "can you tell me what medications I'm supposed to be receiving?" Daisy consulted my chart. "Actually, according to Dr. Scott's orders, you're not on any medications right now. Just IV fluids for hydration during testing. No sedatives, no pain medications, nothing that would affect your mental state." The sedative Aaliyah had tried to give me the night before hadn't been prescribed by Dr. Scott. She'd brought it herself, planning to inject me with an unauthorized drug that could have killed me or left me in a coma. "Has anyone been giving me medications that aren't on this chart?" Daisy frowned and checked the records more carefully. "That's strange. There are some medication administration notes here that aren't matching the physician orders. Let me check with the charge nurse about this discrepancy." After Daisy left, I felt a mixture of validation and terror. I now had proof that Aaliyah had been administering unauthorized medications, but I also realized how close I'd come to death. If I hadn't refused that injection, around 8 a.m., Aaliyah appeared in my doorway, and I could immediately tell something had changed. Her usual mask of concern was strained, and there was a tightness around her eyes that suggested she was under pressure. "Good morning, Mom. How did you sleep?" "Fine," I said, studying her face. "Daisy Clark mentioned that you're not actually assigned to this floor." Aaliyah's smile flickered. "That's right. I pulled some strings to keep an eye on you, even though it's not my usual unit. I hope that's okay." "Of course, dear. I appreciate you looking out for me." But as she checked my fee and updated my chart, I noticed her hands were shaking slightly. Something had rattled her confidence. The answer came an hour later when Thomas appeared in my doorway, dressed in a maintenance worker's uniform and carrying a clipboard. "Ma'am, I need to check the medical equipment in your room," he said in a voice loud enough for anyone in the hallway to hear. Then quietly, "Are you okay? We need to talk." While he pretended to inspect the IV machine, Thomas whispered urgently, "Detective Nelson ran the insurance applications through the system. 5 different companies, all filed within the past 2 months. Total coverage, $2.3 million. But here's the thing. 3 of the companies have already contacted the hospital asking about your medical condition. My blood chilled. What did the hospital tell them? That's what's interesting. The inquiries are all going through Gerald Kelly as your designated insurance representative. He's been providing them with medical updates that don't match your actual condition or the hospital's records. What kind of updates? Progressive dementia, multiple cardiac episodes, medication non-compliance leading to dangerous confusion. According to Kelly's reports to the insurance companies, you're actively dying. The full scope of the fraud was staggering. While Aaliyah worked to actually make me sick or dead in the hospital, Gerald was simultaneously reporting to insurance companies that I was already terminally ill, preparing them to expect my death and process the claims quickly. There's more, Thomas continued, still pretending to work on the equipment. Nelson found financial records. Gerald and Aaliyah have been planning this for over a year. They've been tracking your assets, studying your health patterns, even researching the best methods to cause cardiac events that would look natural. I felt sick. How long have they been working together? Gerald Kelly isn't just an insurance consultant. He's Aaliyah's boyfriend, has been for 18 months. They've been living together, planning this together, and they're planning to disappear together once the insurance money comes through. Everything made sense now. The expensive townhouse, the luxury car, the designer clothes. Aaliyah hadn't been successful through smart investing. She'd been living off money Gerald provided, money he'd made through insurance fraud schemes with other victims. I wasn't her first target. I was just the biggest payout. We have enough evidence to arrest them both, Thomas whispered. But we need to get you out of here safely first. Nelson is coordinating with hospital security and local police. But before Thomas could finish explaining the plan, Aaliyah walked back into the room. "Excuse me," she said to Thomas, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Who authorized you to work on equipment in this room?" Thomas showed her his fake work order. "Routine maintenance, ma'am. Medical equipment safety inspection." Aaliyah studied the clipboard, and I could see her mind working, calculating. After a moment, she smiled that cold smile I'd learned to fear. "Of course. Patient safety is our top priority. Mom, I have some good news. Dr. Scott wants to discharge you today. He thinks you'd be more comfortable recovering at home." The lie was so smooth, so believable, that if I hadn't known the truth, I would have been relieved. But I understood what was really happening. Aaliyah knew the investigation was closing in. The insurance companies were asking questions, unauthorized personnel were in my room, and her timeline was collapsing. She needed to get me out of the hospital and somewhere she could complete her plan without witnesses. "That's wonderful news," I said, matching her fake enthusiasm. "When can we leave?" "Within the hour. I just need to complete your discharge paperwork and arrange transportation." After Aaliyah left, Thomas grabbed my arm. "She's panicking. She's going to try to move you. Somewhere isolated where she can finish this." "What do we do?" "We're not letting you leave this hospital with her. Nelson is already in the building with backup. We're going to end this now." But as Thomas spoke, I heard the unmistakable sound of my door being locked again from the outside. Through the window, I could see Aaliyah talking rapidly on her phone in the hallway, her free hand gesturing urgently. She wasn't arranging my discharge. She was calling Gerald to implement their emergency plan, and I was trapped in a locked room, completely at her mercy, while she prepared to escalate from careful poisoning to something much more immediate and violent. The full truth was finally clear. My daughter had been systematically planning my murder for over a year, working with her boyfriend to defraud insurance companies and steal my life savings. I wasn't a mother to her, I was a business opportunity, and now that their plan was unraveling, they were about to become very dangerous indeed. The sound of the lock clicking shut behind Thomas sent a wave of panic through me, but it also triggered something I hadn't felt in months: pure crystalline clarity. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't confused, wasn't second-guessing myself, wasn't wondering if I was imagining things. I knew exactly what was happening, and I knew I had to act. Thomas immediately moved to the door, testing the handle and examining the lock mechanism. "It's a magnetic lock," he whispered. "Can be controlled from the nurse's station or overridden with a master key." Through the window, we could see Aaliyah pacing in the hallway, still on her phone. Her body language had completely changed. Gone was the calm, professional nurse. She looked frantic, desperate, like someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around her. "She's calling Gerald," I said, watching her animated gestures. "They're going to implement whatever backup plan they discussed." Thomas pulled out his phone and quickly sent a text. Within seconds, he received a response. "Nelson is in the building with 3 other detectives. Hospital security is coordinating with them, but they need a few more minutes to get into position. We might not have a few more minutes." As if to prove my point, Aaliyah ended her call and walked purposefully toward our room. But instead of unlocking the door, she stopped at what I now realized was a maintenance panel in the hallway. She opened it with a key from her hospital badge chain and began manipulating something inside. "What is she doing?" Thomas asked. The answer came immediately. The lights in my room flickered and went out. The steady hum of the ventilation system stopped. Most alarmingly, the medical monitors beside my bed went dark and silent. "She's cutting power to this room," I breathed. "She's isolating us completely." In the dim light filtering through the window, Thomas looked grim. "She's creating a situation where she can claim there was a medical emergency, that your life support failed, that she heroically tried to save you but couldn't. Except I'm not on life support. She will be able to say you were. Who's going to contradict her medical expertise after the fact?" Through the window, we could see Gerald Kelly arriving at the end of the hallway. He wasn't wearing a visitor's badge or following any hospital protocols. He moved like someone who belonged there, who had done this before. Aaliyah handed him something. It looked like a syringe and a small medical vial. They spoke briefly, and then Gerald positioned himself as a lookout while Aaliyah approached. "Our door with a master key. She's coming in," Thomas whispered. "When that door opens, I want you to get behind me and stay there. Thomas, she has medical training. She knows exactly how to kill someone quickly and make it look like natural causes. I know, but she doesn't know I have police training, and she doesn't know backup is coming." The lock clicked, and Aaliyah entered the darkened room. In the low light, she looked almost ghostly in her white scrubs. She was carrying a syringe in one hand and had a stethoscope around her neck, props for the medical emergency she was about to create. "Mom, there's been a power failure," she said in a voice that was trying too hard to sound calm. "I need to check your vitals and possibly administer emergency medication." "What kind of emergency medication?" Thomas asked, stepping slightly forward. Aaliyah's eyes flicked to him, and I saw her reassess the situation. She hadn't expected him to still be in the room. "I'm sorry, but you'll need to leave immediately. This is a medical emergency, and only family members are allowed during crisis situations." "I'm maintenance," Thomas said evenly. "I need to restore power to the medical equipment before any patient care can be administered safely." It was a smart move, positioning himself as essential to her cover story. If she wanted to claim equipment failure had caused my death, she needed the equipment to actually be functioning when the emergency team arrived. But Aaliyah was done with subtlety. "Get out of this room right now, or I'll call security." "Please, do," Thomas replied. "I'd love to explain to security why you're administering unauthorized medications to a patient in a room where you've deliberately cut the power." Aaliyah's mask finally dropped completely. The caring daughter, the concerned medical professional, the worried nurse, all of it vanished, replaced by cold calculation and rage. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," she said, her voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "This has been planned for too long and involves too much money for some maintenance worker to ruin it." She turned to me, and I saw something in her eyes that I'd never seen before. Complete absence of anything resembling love or recognition of our relationship. "Mom, I want you to understand something. This was never personal. You were just convenient. Good credit, valuable assets, the right age to make a natural death believable. Gerald has done this before with elderly clients. It's actually quite a profitable business model." The casual cruelty of her words hit me like a physical blow. She was explaining my murder to me like it was a business transaction. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked. "Since Dad left." I realized then that family is just an accident of genetics. Real relationships are about mutual benefit. Gerald and I benefit each other. You were just an asset to be liquidated." Thomas stepped closer to me, his body tense and ready. "Aaliyah, there are police in this building right now. Detective Nelson is already reviewing your insurance applications and Gerald's financial records. This is over. This is over." Aaliyah laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. "No, it's not. Because in about 30 seconds, my mother is going to have a cardiac episode brought on by the stress of the power failure and equipment malfunction. I'll heroically attempt to resuscitate her, but sadly, she won't survive. Gerald will comfort me through my grief while we collect the insurance money and disappear." She raised the syringe, and I could see a clear liquid inside that I knew would stop my heart within minutes. "The only thing that's going to disappear," Thomas said quietly, "is your freedom." That's when the door burst open and Detective Archie Nelson entered with 2 uniformed officers, their weapons drawn. Aaliyah Cooper put down the syringe and stepped away from the patient. But Aaliyah didn't surrender. Instead, she lunged toward me with the syringe raised, determined to complete her plan even as the police surrounded her. What happened next unfolded in slow motion. Thomas stepped between us, grabbing Aaliyah's wrist as she tried to inject me. Gerald shouted something from the hallway and tried to run. The officers moved to subdue them both. In the struggle, the syringe fell to the floor and shattered, its contents spreading across the hospital linoleum like spilled death. As the handcuffs clicked around Aaliyah's wrists, she looked at me with pure hatred. "You stupid old woman," she spat. "Do you have any idea how much money you just cost me?" Even in defeat, even caught red-handed attempting murder, she couldn't see me as anything more than a failed business opportunity. But I was alive. Thomas was alive. And for the first time in months, I felt safe. The hours following Aaliyah's arrest moved with the methodical precision of a well-orchestrated investigation. Detective Nelson had been building this case for days, and the evidence gathered during those terrifying moments in the hospital room was just the final piece of an already comprehensive prosecution. Within 2 hours of the arrest, I found myself in a conference room at the Willowbrook Police Department, giving my formal statement to a team that included Detective Nelson, a prosecutor from the district attorney's office named Ronald Wright, and a victim advocate who specialized in family crimes. "Mrs. Rivera," Prosecutor Wright began, reviewing the thick file that had already been compiled, "what we have here is one of the most systematic cases of elder fraud and attempted murder we've seen in this jurisdiction. The scope of the conspiracy is remarkable." He spread documents across the conference table: insurance applications, forged medical records, financial statements, and photographs from the surveillance Thomas and I had conducted. "Your daughter and Gerald Kelly have been operating this scheme for at least 2 years. You weren't their first target, and you likely wouldn't have been their last." The revelation that other families had been victimized hit me like a physical blow. "How many others?" Detective Nelson consulted his notes. "We've identified at least 4 other cases in 3 different states. elderly individuals with substantial assets who died under suspicious circumstances after taking out large life insurance policies through Kelly's consulting firm. Did their families know? In 2 cases, the adult daughter were involved, similar to your situation. In the other 2, Kelly worked alone, befriending elderly widows and convincing them to name him as their beneficiary. I thought about those other families, other mothers who had trusted their daughters, other elderly people who had died believing their loved ones cared about them. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. The good news, Prosecutor Wright continued, is that we have overwhelming evidence. The recordings you made, both at your home and in the hospital, provide clear proof of conspiracy to commit murder and insurance fraud. Combined with the financial evidence Detective Nelson gathered and the forensic analysis of the syringe contents, we have a case that should result in significant prison sentences for both defendants. The syringe, it turned out, had contained a concentrated dose of potassium chloride, a substance that would have stopped my heart within minutes and left minimal trace evidence in a standard autopsy. It was the kind of murder weapon that required medical knowledge to obtain and administer, pointing directly to Aaliyah's involvement. What about the forged medical records? I asked. That's actually one of our strongest pieces of evidence, Detective Nelson explained. We've traced the creation of those documents to Gerald Kelly's home computer. He had software specifically designed to replicate medical letterheads and had been using stolen physician credentials to create false medical histories for his victims. The investigation had also uncovered the financial infrastructure of their operation. Gerald and Aaliyah had opened joint accounts in the Cayman Islands, where they had been transferring money from previous insurance payouts. They had already booked plane tickets to leave the country the day after my planned death, with new identities and enough money to disappear permanently. How long would they have gotten away with it if we hadn't caught them? I asked. Prosecutor Wright and Detective Nelson exchanged glances. Honestly, they might never have been caught, Wright admitted. This was a sophisticated operation. If you hadn't been suspicious enough to investigate, and if your ex-husband hadn't had law enforcement connections, Aaliyah's version of events would have been completely believable. The thought chilled me. In their version of the story, I would have been a confused elderly woman whose health declined rapidly, leading to a tragic but natural death in the hospital. Aaliyah would have been the grieving daughter who had tried everything to save me, and Gerald would have been the helpful family friend who guided her through the insurance claims process. Over the next several weeks, as the case was prepared for trial, I learned more details about their operation that made me sick to my stomach. Gerald had been specifically targeting nurses as partners because of their medical access and credibility. He'd had relationships with at least 3 other healthcare workers in different states, teaching them his methods for identifying vulnerable elderly patients and manipulating insurance systems. Aaliyah had been his most successful partner because of her combination of medical knowledge, family access, and complete lack of conscience. The prosecution's psychological evaluation described her as having antisocial personality disorder with narcissistic tendencies. Essentially, she was incapable of feeling genuine empathy or love for anyone, including her own mother. The evidence discovery process also revealed how long Aaliyah had been planning this. Detective Nelson found journals in her apartment dating back 3 years, in which she had calculated my net worth, researched my health conditions, and planned various scenarios for my death. She'd written about me like I was a business acquisition, noting my assets and vulnerabilities with cold analytical detachment. One journal entry, dated 18 months before her arrest, was particularly chilling. Target shows appropriate trust level and has no significant health issues that would complicate timeline. Estimated liquidation value, 2.8 matters, including life insurance, property, and business assets. Implementation timeline, 12-18 months. She had been planning my murder for over a year and a half. The prosecution also uncovered evidence that Aaliyah had been gradually poisoning me with small doses of substances that would cause the symptoms she'd been reporting to doctors: confusion, dizziness, memory problems. The expensive chocolates she'd been bringing me weren't gifts. They were delivery mechanisms for drugs that would support her narrative of my declining health. The level of premeditation here is extraordinary, Prosecutor Wright told me during one of our preparation sessions. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. This was a calculated, long-term conspiracy that treated you as nothing more than a financial opportunity. The hardest part of this process wasn't learning about the conspiracy. It was accepting that my daughter had never loved me. The caring, devoted daughter I thought I'd raised had been a performance, a role she'd played to gain access to my trust and my assets. Every hug had been calculated. Every expression of concern had been manipulation. Every "I love you" had been a lie designed to keep me compliant while she planned my murder. But as devastating as these revelations were, they also brought a strange sense of relief. For months, I'd been doubting my own perceptions, wondering if I was paranoid or losing my mind. Now I knew that my instincts had been right all along. I wasn't crazy. I was being systematically victimized by someone who had perfected the art of deception. The case was scheduled to go to trial in 6 months, but Prosecutor Wright was confident that the overwhelming evidence would likely result in plea bargains. Both Aaliyah and Gerald were facing charges that could result in life sentences, and their attorneys were already suggesting they might be willing to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. "Would you be comfortable with a plea agreement?" Wright asked me. I thought about it for a long moment. Part of me wanted to see them face a jury, to have their crimes exposed in full public view. But another part of me just wanted it to be over. "I want them to pay for what they did," I said finally. "Not just to me, but to all their victims. Whatever achieves justice for everyone they've hurt, that's what I want." As we prepared for the legal proceedings, I realized that this phase of the ordeal was different from what had come before. I was no longer a victim trying to survive. I was a witness helping to ensure that justice was served. And for the first time in months, I felt like I had some control over my own life again. The day of reckoning came not in a dramatic courtroom trial, but in a sterile conference room at the district attorney's office on a gray Tuesday morning in October. Both Aaliyah and Gerald had ultimately decided to accept plea agreements rather than face the overwhelming evidence against them in a public trial. I sat between Thomas and Prosecutor Wright, watching as my daughter entered the room in an orange jumpsuit, her hands shackled. She looked thinner than I remembered, her hair pulled back severely, but her eyes still held that cold calculation I'd learned to recognize and fear. Gerald Kelly followed behind her, flanked by his own attorney. He looked older, defeated, like a man who had finally been caught after years of thinking he was smarter than everyone around him. Before we proceed with the formal sentencing, Judge Frederick Scott, no relation to the doctor who had been manipulated, addressed the room. "I want to make sure everyone understands the terms of these plea agreements." Prosecutor Wright stood and consulted his notes. "Your Honor, Aaliyah Cooper has agreed to plead guilty to conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, insurance fraud, elder abuse, forgery of medical documents, and unauthorized administration of controlled substances. In exchange for her cooperation in identifying other victims and providing testimony against co-conspirators in similar schemes, the state is recommending a sentence of 25 years to life with the possibility of parole after 20 years. 20 years. My daughter would be 54 when she might be eligible for parole, if she lived that long. Gerald Kelly," Wright continued, "has agreed to plead guilty to conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, insurance fraud, identity theft, racketeering, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise. Mr. Kelly was the architect of this scheme and has been involved in similar conspiracies that resulted in at least 4 confirmed deaths. The state is recommending a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. Life without parole. Gerald would die in prison." Judge Scott turned to Aaliyah. "Ms. Cooper, do you understand the charges against you and the terms of this plea agreement?" "Yes, Your Honor." Her voice was steady, professional, like she was answering a question during a nursing exam. "Do you wish to make a statement before sentencing?" Aaliyah looked directly at me for the first time since entering the room. For a moment, I thought I saw something that might have been regret or recognition of what she had lost. But when she spoke, her words shattered any remaining illusion I might have had about redemption. "Your Honor, I want to acknowledge that my actions caused pain to my family and violated the trust that patients place in healthcare professionals. I take full responsibility for my poor judgment." Poor judgment. She was describing attempted murder, systematic fraud, and a years-long conspiracy as poor judgment. I also want my mother to know that while I made serious mistakes, my original intention was to secure her financial future and ensure she would be properly cared for as she aged. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that if I hadn't lived through her attempts to kill me, I might have believed her. Even now, facing life in prison, she was still manipulating the narrative, still trying to frame herself as a caring daughter who had simply made some bad choices. Judge Scott was not impressed. "Ms. Cooper, the evidence in this case shows a level of premeditation and callousness that defies comprehension. You systematically planned your mother's murder for over 2 years, manipulated medical professionals, forged documents, and nearly succeeded in killing the woman who gave you life. This was not poor judgment, this was evil." Then it was Gerald's turn. His attorney had clearly advised him to show remorse, and his statement was filled with carefully crafted expressions of regret and claims of mental health issues that had influenced his behavior. "Your Honor, I deeply regret the pain I've caused to families who trusted me. I know that no apology can undo the harm I've done, but I want the victims' families to know that I think about them every day and wish I could take back my actions." Judge Scott stared at him for a long moment. "Mr. Kelly, you operated what can only be described as a murder-for-profit enterprise. You systematically targeted elderly individuals, manipulated their loved ones, and orchestrated their deaths for financial gain. The court has reviewed evidence suggesting you may have been involved in as many as 8 additional suspicious deaths beyond the confirmed cases. You are a predator who preyed on the most vulnerable members of our society. When it came time for victim impact statements, I had prepared remarks, but found myself speaking from the heart instead. Your Honor, for months I questioned my own sanity because my daughter was so skilled at manipulation. She didn't just try to kill my body, she tried to kill my mind first, making me doubt my own perceptions and memories. The cruelest part wasn't that she wanted me dead. It was that she convinced everyone who loved me that I was losing my faculties, so that when I tried to ask for help, no one believed me." I looked directly at Aaliyah as I continued. "I will never understand how someone can look at the person who raised them and see only a financial opportunity. But I want you to know that despite everything you did, despite the lies and the manipulation and the attempts on my life, I grieve for the daughter I thought I had. Not for you, you were never real, but for the person I believed you to be." Aaliyah's expression never changed. She watched me with the same clinical detachment she'd shown throughout the entire ordeal. The sentences were handed down exactly as the plea agreement specified. 25 to life for Aaliyah. Life without parole for Gerald. As they were led away in shackles, Gerald looked broken, defeated. But Aaliyah walked out with her head high, like someone heading to a business meeting rather than to spend the next 2 decades in prison. In the hallway afterward, Prosecutor Wright pulled me aside. "The investigation into their other victims is ongoing. Gerald's cooperation has been valuable, but Aaliyah has provided minimal assistance. She seems to view this as a temporary setback rather than consequences for her actions. Do you think she feels any remorse at all?" Wright shook his head. "In my experience with cases like this, people with her psychological profile don't feel remorse the way normal people do. She's upset that she got caught, not that she hurt people." Detective Nelson joined us, carrying a box of evidence that would be returned to me. Photos, documents, personal items that had been collected during the investigation. Mrs. Rivera, I want you to know that your courage in documenting this conspiracy likely saved other lives. We've been able to alert law enforcement in several states about similar schemes, and we've identified potential victims who were in the early stages of being targeted. The aftermath of the sentencing brought unexpected media attention. The case had captured public attention because of its shocking nature. A daughter attempting to murder her mother for insurance money. But the story that emerged in news reports focused on the broader implications. How elder fraud was becoming more sophisticated, how healthcare workers could abuse their trusted positions, and how insurance companies needed better safeguards against fraudulent claims. Several family members of Gerald's other victims reached out to me through the Victim Advocate's office. We formed an unlikely support group, people who had lost parents, grandparents, and spouses to this predatory scheme. Sharing our stories helped all of us understand that we weren't alone in our experience of betrayal and manipulation. The most meaningful contact came from the family of Eleanor Martinez, an 78-year-old widow who had died 2 years earlier under circumstances that were now clearly suspicious. Her son, Noah Johnson, had always wondered about the sudden decline in his mother's health and her unexpected death shortly after meeting Gerald Kelly. Your bravery in exposing this gave us answers we've been searching for, Noah told me during a phone call. We're finally able to have closure and know that justice was served for our mother. But perhaps the most satisfying consequence wasn't the prison sentences. It was what happened to the carefully constructed reputations that Aaliyah and Gerald had built. Gerald's insurance consulting business was shut down, his licenses revoked, and his assets seized to compensate victims. Every professional organization he'd belonged to expelled him. His name became synonymous with elder fraud in law enforcement circles. Aaliyah lost her nursing license permanently and was banned from ever working in healthcare again. Oakridge Medical Center implemented new protocols for monitoring staff access to patients and medications, policies that would be adopted by hospitals across the state. The insurance companies that had been defrauded launched their own investigation and discovered that Gerald had been operating similar schemes in multiple states for nearly a decade. The financial losses were estimated at over $15 million, leading to industry-wide changes in how large life insurance policies are. Investigated and approved. As I watched the consequences unfold, the prison sentences, the professional destruction, the systemic changes designed to prevent similar crimes, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, but a quiet sense of justice being served. Aaliyah and Gerald had built their success on the trust and vulnerability of elderly people. Now they would spend their remaining years as powerless and isolated as they had made their victims feel. 30. Reckoning was complete, but my healing was just beginning. 6 months after the sentencing, I stood in the garden behind my house in Willowbrook, my hands deep in rich soil, planting tulip bulbs for next spring's bloom. The simple act of nurturing something that would grow and flourish felt like a metaphor for my own recovery. Burying something in darkness with faith that it would eventually reach toward the light. The therapy had been essential. Dr. Amara Scott, a trauma specialist who worked specifically with victims of family crimes, helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't just attempted murder. It was a profound betrayal that had shattered my fundamental understanding of trust, family, and my own judgment. What you survived, Dr. Scott had explained during one of our early sessions, was psychological torture designed to make you question your own reality. The fact that you maintained enough clarity to investigate and document what was happening shows remarkable strength. But strength, I learned, wasn't the same as healing. For months after the trial, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, checking locks, looking over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that I was still being watched or manipulated. Every phone call made me anxious. Every unexpected visitor sent me into a panic. The nightmares were the worst part. Not dreams about the hospital room or the syringe, but dreams where Aaliyah was still the loving daughter I'd thought she was, where I'd wake up believing the whole ordeal had been a terrible mistake. Those dreams hurt more than the nightmares about attempted murder, because they reminded me of how completely I'd been deceived. Thomas had been my anchor during those dark months. He'd stayed in Willowbrook longer than originally planned, helping me navigate the legal proceedings and the practical aftermath of having my life turned upside down. Our relationship had evolved from the cautious cooperation of divorced parents into something deeper, a partnership forged by shared crisis and mutual respect. I keep thinking about the signs I missed, I'd told him one evening as we sat on my front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. "You didn't miss signs," Thomas had replied firmly. "You responded to every instinct you had. The manipulation was designed to be invisible, even to someone as smart as you. Don't blame yourself for being a loving mother." Rivera's garden paradise had become my sanctuary and my salvation. Returning to work had been terrifying at first. Aaliyah had poisoned even that safe space by visiting regularly and undermining my confidence about my abilities. But slowly, surrounded by the familiar rhythms of arranging flowers and serving customers, I began to remember who I was before my daughter's conspiracy had nearly destroyed me. My customers had been incredibly supportive once the story became public. Instead of treating me like a victim to be pitied, they embraced me as someone who had survived something unthinkable and emerged stronger. Mrs. Helen Martinez, a regular customer who ordered flowers for her restaurant weekly, became an unexpected friend and confidant. "You know what I admire about you," Helen had said one afternoon as I arranged centerpieces for her establishment. "You didn't let that evil destroy your ability to create beauty. Look at these arrangements. They're more vibrant than ever." Was right. My work had taken on a new intensity and creativity, as if surviving the attempt on my life had freed me to express myself more boldly. I'd started incorporating more unusual elements: wild branches, unexpected color combinations, asymmetrical designs that broke traditional rules, but somehow felt more honest and alive. The victim support group that had formed organically among the families affected by Gerald and Aaliyah's crimes had become another source of healing. We met monthly at the Willowbrook Community Center, sharing our experiences and supporting each other through the ongoing process of recovery. Noah Johnson, whose mother Eleanor had been one of Gerald's earlier victims, had become particularly close to our family. His mother's death had initially been attributed to natural causes, but the investigation had revealed evidence of the same systematic poisoning that I'd experienced. Unlike me, Eleanor hadn't survived long enough to expose the truth. "Your courage gave my mother justice," Noah had told me during one of our group meetings. But more than that, it prevented other families from going through what we did. That knowledge that my survival had protected other potential victims had become a source of meaning that helped transform my trauma into something purposeful. I'd started speaking at conferences about elder abuse prevention, sharing my story with healthcare workers, insurance professionals, and family members who might recognize similar warning signs. The speaking engagements were difficult at first. Reliving the experience publicly, describing the systematic manipulation and attempted murder, brought back waves of anxiety and pain. But each time I told my story, I saw recognition in someone's eyes. A healthcare worker who realized they needed to be more vigilant about unauthorized access to patients, an insurance agent who understood the need for better verification procedures, or a family member who suddenly understood why their elderly relative had been acting strangely. One of the most meaningful responses came from a nurse in Oregon who contacted me after hearing my presentation at a medical conference. She'd been concerned about a colleague who seemed unusually interested in elderly patients' financial situations and had been asking inappropriate questions about their family relationships and assets. My story gave her the framework to recognize potential predatory behavior and report it to authorities. "You probably saved lives by speaking up," the nurse wrote in her letter. The colleague I reported is now under investigation, and we've implemented new protocols based on the warning signs you described. My relationship with the concept of family had been fundamentally altered by my experience. The biological connection that had made Aaliyah's betrayal possible also made it devastating in a way that no stranger's crime could have been. But I'd learned that family could be something chosen rather than simply inherited. Thomas and I had remarried in a small ceremony the previous spring, surrounded by the friends who had supported us through the crisis. Trisha Davies, who had initially dismissed my concerns about Aaliyah, had become one of my strongest supporters and closest confidants. Kevin Morgan, my neighbor, had appointed himself my unofficial security consultant, always checking in and making sure I felt safe. Detective Nelson and Prosecutor Wright had become friends rather than just professional contacts, stopping by occasionally to update me on related cases and to check on my well-being. Even Dr. Scott from the hospital had reached out to apologize for being manipulated by Aaliyah's lies and to express his admiration for my courage in exposing the truth. This chosen family, built on shared experience, mutual respect, and genuine care, felt more solid and trustworthy than the biological relationship that had nearly destroyed me. The most surprising aspect of my recovery had been the discovery of my own resilience. For 64 years, I'd thought of myself as someone who needed protection, who relied on others for major decisions, who wasn't strong enough to handle serious crises alone. But I'd investigated a criminal conspiracy, gathered evidence, survived multiple murder attempts, and helped bring dangerous criminals to justice. "You were always this strong," Dr. Scott had told me during one of our final therapy sessions. "You just never had a reason to access that strength before. Crisis doesn't create character, it reveals it." As I knelt in my garden that October afternoon, pressing tulip bulbs into the earth, I thought about the cycle of seasons and the cycles of life. Aaliyah's betrayal had been like a brutal winter that had nearly killed everything I thought I knew about myself and my world. But winter always gives way to spring, and the growth that follows can be more beautiful than what came before. I was Cree, 65 now, with silver threads running through my hair and lines around my eyes that spoke of both sorrow and wisdom. I would never be the same person I'd been before my daughter's conspiracy nearly destroyed me. But I'd become someone stronger, more aware, more capable of protecting myself and others. The tulips I was planting would bloom in the spring, pushing through whatever winter brought to reach toward the light. Just like me, I was no longer a victim of my daughter's crimes. I was a survivor, an advocate, and a woman who had reclaimed her own life from those who had tried to steal it. And that life, built on truth rather than lies, felt more valuable than anything they could have taken from me. 2 years later, I received a letter forwarded through the prison system. The envelope was marked with Aaliyah's inmate number, and for a moment, my hands trembled as I held it. Thomas found me in the kitchen, staring at the unopened letter. "You don't have to read it," he said gently. "I know, but I think I need to." The letter was brief, written in Aaliyah's familiar handwriting. "Mom, I've been in therapy here, and my counselor says I should try to make amends. I want you to know that I understand now how much I hurt you. I was sick, and I made terrible choices. I hope someday you can forgive me. Love, Aaliyah." I read it, twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. Thomas watched me with concern. "How do you feel?" I considered the question seriously. "Sad," I said finally. "Not for her, but for the daughter I thought I had. This letter, it's just another manipulation. She still doesn't understand that what she did wasn't sick, it was evil." That evening, I called Dr. Scott to discuss the letter. She wasn't surprised by its contents. People with her psychological profile often learn to mimic the language of remorse and recovery, especially when they think it might benefit them, she explained. True accountability would involve accepting full responsibility, without asking for forgiveness or claiming illness as an excuse. I never wrote back. Some chapters, I'd learned, were meant to stay closed. 6 months later, Noah Johnson called with news that Gerald Kelly had died in prison, a heart attack at age 52. Aaliyah would serve her full sentence if she lived that long. Justice, it seemed, had its own timeline. Today, Rivera's garden paradise thrives more than ever. The window displays a small plaque, in memory of Eleanor Martinez and all victims of elder abuse. Every arrangement I create carries a little of her story, a little of mine, and a promise that beauty can grow from even the darkest soil. The tulips I planted that October day bloom every spring now, pushing through the earth toward the light, reminding me that survival is not just about enduring, it's about choosing to flourish despite everything that tries to break you. I am 67 now, and I have never felt more alive. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.